Disinformation knows no borders, and today the stakes seem higher than ever. Welcome to Truth Talks, a brave new podcast series tackling the challenges of fake news head-on. Join us for engaging short conversations with experts from all EU member states and Ukraine as we uncover the truth behind dominant disinformation trends and explore the strategies shaping Europe's fight against manipulation. In this episode, we are zooming on Denmark. Today's guest is Thomas Hedin, editor-in-chief of projekt, the Danish fact-checking media. Welcome to Truth Talks.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Okay, as a country with a high level of digitalization and strong media institutions, Denmark has its own unique challenges when it comes to disinformation. What are the dominant disinformation narratives circulating in Denmark?
Well, I will start by saying that you're right. There is a high level of resilience of what concerns digital media literacy, competences, and so on, but we can get back to that. Until recently, the most predominant disinformation narratives in Denmark related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including claims that Ukraine is massively corrupt, Zelensky is a Western puppet, and the claims that that Ukraine is heavily Nazified, so to speak, are Nazis, all of them. But recently, there's been some recent development geopolitical which has involved Denmark. So a completely different topic is now dominating the disinformation ecosystem, and that is the situation around Greenland. Greenland is a part, as you might know, of the Kingdom of Denmark, and the United States in particular has shown public interest in somehow taking over Greenland.
And it's not the first time.
And it's not the first time, but this time it's very explicit, we must say. Purchasing it or trying to persuade the Greenlandic people or even outright invading Greenland. He has, quite surprisingly, President Trump himself has stated that such a scenario is not off the table. And disinformation on this topic has come from actually both East and West, attempting to control the narrative around this debate. The primary strategy has been to spread claims that, in one way or another, depict a serious conflict between Denmark and Greenland. It is true that for many years, there has indeed been some tense relationship between the two countries, with Greenlanders feeling treated as a colony, and Danes may have been somewhat indifferent, not that interested in Greenland. And disinformation from multiple sources is now trying to inflame this tension between Danes and Greenlandic people. Again, presumably to push Greenland towards now having a independence referendum, or seeking closer ties simply with, for instance, the United States. So they gradually would distance themselves from Denmark. That is a very predominant topic right now. Naturally, COVID-19, like all over the world, also was a dominant topic. And what we see, and I understand that counts also for Poland and the rest of the EU countries, is that the same actors who spread vaccine misinformation or disinformation are now disseminating, for instance, anti-Ukrainian narratives and Greenland, the whole situation around Greenland. Furthermore, I would say also of more day-to-day topics and narratives here concerns renewable energy.
That it is bad for you and expensive?
Yeah, and what we have to take into consideration is that Denmark has been a forerunner of implementing sustainable energy for many years. Just to say, for how long? On a good day with enough wind and sunshine, Denmark can actually produce twice as much electricity than we need with simply that. So there has been a lot of investments into renewable energy, and which also has those money have to come from somewhere, and a lot of it is from energy prices. So of course this is something everyone can relate to. So a lot about windmills and so on has been, and EVs. I don't know if you see that, and I don't know if you see that in Poland also.
We don't have so much disinformation about EVs yet.
It will come.
Probably, yeah. So it will come from Denmark.
It will. You will import our.
You are actually the first speaker, and I have had some speakers already from the Western EU. No one has mentioned EVs yet, I must say.
No one, really?
No one. Energy, Green Deal stuff, of course. And it's kind of somehow related, but EVs, not yet.
No. Maybe it's because here it's the EVs, is perhaps you could see as the next step after renewable energy. That's a new topic you can dive
But
specific.
what is being said about EVs?
They're very much about how they, if you sit in a snow weather on a queue on the highway, your battery will be low within 1 hour unless you're sitting there and freezing, which is not true. An EV doesn't need that much energy to warm up your car. It can do that for 3 days, even if necessary. Or something around the batteries. Bad they are for the climate, actually, to produce. Maybe, and presented it as being even worse than fossil fuel cars.
So again, from Russia, or maybe from the lobbyists on the side of fossil cars?
No, but you know what is interesting here about this topic is, if we look at mis and disinformation, Danes are not that good at producing disinformation themselves. It's mostly imported, so to speak, from the rest of the internet. But especially EVs and sustainable energy seems to have been something that has grown from within the Danish borders, actually.
Probably you're a rich society, and there are many more EVs than in other countries, and therefore it's being disinformed about.
Yeah, and I guess we talked about how will it be something that will dominate in Poland. With the EU decision to stop selling fossil fuel cars from 2035, of course, this debate will show up everywhere in the EU, my guess is.
And the EU itself?
Well, that is interesting because generally, what we must say is Denmark has always been, for many years, been a country where the Danish population, a common opinion was that we don't really like the EU. We're a small country and it's dangerous to be part of that. But opinion polls shows that has turned totally opposite. And it seems like that has meant that what we might have seen before on misinformation about the EU and so on, we don't really see it anymore. It's not so dominant anymore.
Coming back to the first disinformation narrative that you mentioned, which was the Russian invasion on Ukraine, you said that now the Greenland is the thing. I wanted to ask if the change of the American administration in their approach towards Zelensky and Ukraine, has it also changed the approach to Zelensky being treated by disinformation as a puppet of the West? Which certainly now we see that at least not a puppet of the US. So is this also transforming the disinformation, the reality? Does it influence the disinformation landscape?
Does it influence that we now have the American administration, is your question? Maybe a little bit, but I mean, what you have to think is Denmark is among the countries contributing most to the Ukrainian war, if you compare it to population size. And it's the feeling that the support for Ukraine has been very high almost all the time. It is going down a little bit, but I think we are around the time people just want peace. And it is expensive. So to a certain extent, we do see the American narrative shared here also. But still, it's not dominating the overall disinformation. It's still the other way around when we talk about Ukraine.
Okay, let's turn to actors. Who is behind that? Who is creating the disinformation and who is spreading the disinformation, as the two types of actors don't need to be the same ones?
Well, as I said, Danes are not, thank God, particularly active in inventing false information, I would
Apart
say.
from the EVs.
Yeah, besides the EVs and some of the and climate change issues. But also we are quite good at importing it. The Greenlandic situation has changed a little bit, but Russia is still the primary external actor when we talk about disinformation, targeting Denmark. But as I said, we also see now that the situation on Greenland has changed, as quite a lot now also comes from the West. And that's the Greenlandic situation. We kind of hear in the newsroom, the fact checker sometimes sits with the feeling, my God, now we're sitting in the middle of two major actors on both sides. It's a storm. And that, of course, has to do specifically with the Greenlandic situation. But if we turn back to what concerns Russia, one example is Operation Overload, where false fact-checking requests were sent to media outlets, not only here, but as it was later stated all over Europe. But that was a very targeted operation, you could say. Here we also have some low-cost pro-Russian disinformation websites in Danish, such as local versions of Euromor or Pravda. But these sites are often featured using AI-generated content. So they're small, they don't really play a role like that. Because when you look at it, you obviously have a hard time believing in it because the language is bad. Domestic actors, including conspiracy theory communities and some political figures, also contribute to the spread of misinformation, definitely. Though for us, it is unclear how much of this is influenced by external sources.
How would you define the specificity, the unique character of disinformation landscape in Denmark? Apart from not being very vulnerable to disinformation or not having too many disinformation creators locally, what is the unique characteristics of Denmark's disinformation landscape?
Well, the unique thing probably also is, as I think I said in the beginning, we don't see the same level of problems as I can see my colleagues in Southern European and Eastern European countries specifically. We are not that flooded with the disinformation. And that perhaps can have more than one reason. For one is that teaching media literacy to the younger people and students was already part of curriculum more than 10 years ago. So you could say we have a whole generation now that's already quite well dressed, which gives us a quite high level of disinformation resilience. But of course, also the disinformation landscape has developed so fast, even for the last, what would you say, year or 2 years or something, that that is not enough. That we have had this in the curriculum for many years. We have to keep up the pace, definitely.
You're answering questions before I ask them. So, no problem. That's great. So, now I just wanted to ask you first what's being done to counter disinformation in Denmark? And second, what more would you recommend to be done to tackle disinformation, production, to tackle disinformation vulnerability in the society?
Besides, there is a steady focus on media literacy and teaching also elderly people, definitely. There is a high political attention on this issue right now. I know it's all over Europe. There is a high level of attention on this, but especially also here. A lot of initiatives has actually been done here. If we look at it on the political level, Czechta is actually partly funded via the Public Service Act, which means partly our financial basis, core finance, comes from the same act as the national broadcaster, equivalent to BBC or whatever. And you will find also other initiatives like money for scientists to investigate into this. The state even created their own agency, which is solely working on mis and disinformation, analyzing it, and that agency is supposed to advise the politicians, and they're quite big. That was a new initiative that came up, and of course, what is going on now after Meta's decision, which was announced earlier January. This has conducted a lot of political discussions all over. What we also see is Czechta is being increasingly invited by scientists and by organizations that wants to develop more media literacy material. I think I've never got so many emails from external actors asking if we wanted to participate in this. And I think that's great. Also because what I get a sense of right now is before earlier days, mis and disinformation was something, you had an actor here who did media literacy material, or scientists sitting over here doing something, you had Czechta doing something, etc. But it's very obvious to me that it's becoming more of a community where we have a better contact to each other. So instead of you have somebody over here developing some kind of important initiative against disinformation or media literacy material or whatever it is, and you have the same thing down here in the other corner, we are starting to talk together. Instead of making things twice, you're making a better product together. And that's something that really has developed over the past 2 years, I would say. So a lot of attention on it on different levels here.
I wanted to ask, you are mentioning all what is being done and what has changed. But as you mentioned, this disinformation landscape also fluctuates, changes a lot. And what more would you recommend to be done in the future to protect the media sphere, the Danish democracy against disinformation?
That's a huge question. I mean, if I could give all the answers, I think I would be a good popular politician. First of all, in Europe, we right now are in this conflict, or the platforms are in conflict with the EU over the EU regulation on platforms, the DSA and the Code of Conduct on Disinformation. What I would told actually politicians yesterday participating in a hearing in the parliament, as well, it sounds so nice as an expert, was that they have to give the DSA and the Code of Conduct on Disinformation really good attention, to stick to it as much as possible, and don't be pushed into a narrative that the Code of Conduct suppresses freedom of speech, because that is not true. the code of conduct doesn't say anything about deleting stuff on social media platforms. Also, I think as I said just before, creating a better network or knowledge of what are the various actors working here. I'm not saying that we all have to work together. I mean, Czechtiv would, of course, as a editorial media, never work with everybody that might affect our trustworthiness. But at least that we can know what's going on. And the media literacy level, definitely we have to keep up. But the latest development really tells us the most important thing to do right now is keeping the tech industry, the tech platforms, as accountable as we can. That is, I think, very important on the same time that we ensure freedom of speech, of course.
That is also very tough. But okay, thank you very much for all this constructive advice. And this brings us to the end of our conversation about the Danish disinformation landscape. Thomas, thank you so much for sharing your so important insights.
Thank you, and so much thank you for having me.
Truth Talk series is part of the project Guardians of Truth, fact-checking during Poland's EU presidency, which is supported by European Media and Information Fund, managed by Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation.